Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School, and I'd like to provide some background information that should be particularly relevant to our Class 11 in the sales class. Recall again, we are now in Article 2, dealing with sale of goods, and occasionally special rules when it involves a merchant, or in certain cases, merchants, where it's the plural. Last time, we're talking about the UCC and provisions that try to get away from legal formalism. In the old days, if the acceptance was any different than the offer, it represented a rejection / counteroffer. And so we'd flip-flop who the offeror was and who the offeree was. Well, that's very formalistic, and it does not really match today's commercial reality. And so now, the UCC in Article 2 is trying to find ways to keep the parties together on those issues, on those contractual aspects for which there is agreement. And then, rather than have rejection counteroffer, lock those in and then either gap fill or otherwise deal with problems so that you maintain the contractual relationship, okay? And then you have ways of addressing things that don't quite fit without this explosion of, oh, that's a rejection, that's a counteroffer. Mind you, if an acceptance is different enough, especially on one or several Dickert terms that are ordinarily the part of negotiations and discord, a disagreement in fact, then you probably don't have a formed contract. But often, parties are very, very close and don't mind, they don't really agree on these small details like the exact date of shipping, okay? And that shouldn't be something that leads to the decision that there is no formed contract. In fact, we should hold them together and then just find a way to save what was missing, what was not quite clear. And so we move away from a legal formalism of contract to something a little bit more flexible that takes into account the realities of people, of how people negotiate, how people bargain. Because nobody's going to dot every I and cross every T for every single contract. There's going to be a lot taken on faith. Oh, you're going to mail it within a reasonable time. If we don't set a price, you're going to set it reasonable under the circumstances. And so we have those gap fillers, which are, you find them throughout the Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, and of course the state's adoption of that model code, including the, is it 1304, implied duty of good faith and fair dealing, which runs throughout any process of involving the sale of goods. Then there's some more specific ones, and you find them in sections 2-305 to 2-311, which include things like an open price term. How should we fix it without throwing the contract to pieces or blowing it up? What is the delivery time and date or the details of delivery? If that's missing, we should still have an agreement. And when the parties disagree over that and try to walk away, let's keep them there and imply, gap fill, that particular provision, having the parties work in good faith. Last time we also talked about installment contracts. Keep in mind, the only real issue there is when you have, let's say, 12 deliveries and one of them is bad. That is probably a breach only to that bad delivery, not the rest. And you can't throw away the entire contract where the breach only damages you for that one non-conforming delivery, okay? If, however, there's a substantial impairment by that one delivery breach, just that one, substantially impairs the value of the entire contract, then the non-breaching party may be entitled to treat it as a breach, to throw out the contract, and to seek damages for the whole thing. But make sure it's big enough so that the breach of one installment really is a breach of the entire agreement. Okay? Last time we also talked about risk of loss. We are going to do that again today. Last time we talked about 2-509, risk of loss when the goods are conforming, or as the code likes to say, risk of loss, no breach. So when the goods are coming and they're conforming, that is not a problem, all right? Then the risk of loss will shift based on whether it's a shipment contract, and that would be if the goods are properly delivered to the carrier for shipping. Then the risk of loss would flip-flop now onto the buyer from the seller at that millisecond. If the seller did not get the proper shipping taken care of, then the seller would not have shifted the risk of loss yet. Destination contracts, that's where the seller is told to get a shipper to take to a particular place. Seller remains responsible for risk of loss until it reaches that destination and there's a tender for the buyer to take it over. Okay? We talked as well last time about how you deal with a nonconformity. And the first rule is the perfect tender rule. If there is any nonconformity between the product, the good that is delivered, and how it was promised, the buyer has the right to reject. The right to reject subject, however, to a cure period, right? There's time for reasonable inspection. And if there's time, then there's a cure period. And there are two cure periods. There's one if time for performance is not yet due. There's another one after time of performance is due. It has been delivered, but the seller reasonably thought that he or she had delivered something conforming. And if it turned out to be non-conforming, the code provides a little bit more time for the seller to try and fix it because he or she was really close and had an honest belief that it was going to be fine anyway, perhaps with a bit of a price adjustment. So see if you can keep those two in mind. That would be the wonderful distinction to test on a multiple choice question. Okay? But perfect tender, you have the right to reject the whole, accept the whole and sue for damages, or accept any commercially reasonable unit and sue for damages for the non-conforming parts. The thing about rejecting a non-conforming tender, all you have to do is allege non-conformity as a buyer, and the seller then has to prove it conformed. So the burden of proof is really on the seller there. And so you've got the concepts of whose burden of proof it is, which we just mentioned, what you can and cannot do by way of rejecting full sum, right? And don't forget the cure period before you find the timing or the ability to treat as a breach or to reject. And don't forget that parties have a reasonable time to inspect. And so you might have the goods in your warehouse for 3 or 4 days before you will have been deemed to have accepted them, because you do have an inspection period that is beyond the moment of delivery. Okay, so perfect tender and the ability to reject has to take into account, if the facts so indicate, problems like whether there's still time to cure and whether or not there's an inspection for a kind of a hidden defect and how long that would last, reasonable under the circumstances. Next thing we covered was revocation. If there has been an acceptance, either because the person said yes or because the time for reasonable inspection or the reasonable time for inspection has passed, that equals acceptance. A buyer can still revoke acceptance. Two differences. The burden of proof is higher. It's not for any nonconformity. Now it's for a substantial impairment. Secondly, the burden has shifted. It's not on the seller to prove conformity. It's now on the buyer who's arguing revocation that there's this substantial detriment based on the performance, the goods tendered. Okay, so the burden of proof has shifted now onto the buyer. Finally, whether it's because it's too late to reject or to revoke, or because the buyer wants the goods, but they're still not perfect. There's still the possibility of warranty liability. And so a party can ask for breach of implied warranty of merchantability, breach of implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose, if there's been a specific promise that was part of the basis of the bargain for the buyer to actually make the purchase. Also, any express warranties, if any, were in fact made. So that was last week. This week the material is not that heavy, and so we cover this time not risk of loss without a breach, but a risk of loss with breach. What if a seller ships the wrong thing? That would be a nonconformity, which is in breach of the agreement. The moment that the risk of loss switches is different. Okay? And it is the risk switches after the buyer has accepted those non-conforming goods knowingly, or where the seller has in fact effectuated a cure. At such time as there's delivery and the cure, then there's an acceptance. Or if the buyer says, I'll just take them and I'll sue you for breach of warranty, but I'll take them, the risk of loss would switch at that very moment. So you see, no breach, the risk of loss could be while the goods are in transit. With a breach, goods are where they're supposed to be, then there's a possible cure period or an inspection period, and it's not until those periods are over that there'd be a switch in the risk of loss from seller onto the buyer when you've got some kind of shipping or a carrier involved to move goods from one place to another. Okay? We will cover briefly one or two questions that deal with the identification of goods to a particular contract. I have a warehouse, you ordered 100, all my goods are destroyed except for 90. Do you have the right to those 90 of the 100? And the question, or the answer could be yes, if I've already allocated those specific pieces to your contract. And so that has some relevance, and I believe that we have one or two questions that we can work through in class. And because we have more time this class, there's a little bit less material to deal with, we will in fact go over a few more problems very meticulously, going through code provisions, using code language, so that we don't forget the job with code is to find the appropriate section, find the appropriate phrase, what it covers. If we don't understand it, we go into the comments, which are the official comments, are not binding, but they're extremely persuasive, and they really help to lay out what's going on. And for particularly difficult issues that the law has seen in the past, they actually include examples. For example, in this case, which happens a lot, this is the way to do it. Or if you remember Safe Harbor we talked about a few weeks ago, that is difficult, and there are specific examples to show how that works. Okay? Okay, then we're going to talk a little bit about certain defenses. Assume that the contract is formed. Assume that there's been some kind of a problem, possibly a breach. Now, the UCC does in fact provide for certain kinds of defenses to contractual liability. One of them is in UCC-2-615, or your state's adoption of same, right? And that would be, it's the impossibility of performance. The exact title is Excuse by Failure of a Presupposed Condition. Well, if you order widgets from me, we presume that the Earth is still going to be here tomorrow so I can mail the widgets. Okay, if the Earth is not here, I can't mail you the widgets, and I have a defense to you suing me for the lack of getting you those widgets. Okay, extreme, unforeseen shortages in raw materials to make a good might qualify, and we're looking at who bears the risk of loss. And just because you lose some profit, you lose some money, that's not enough to make a fair argument that you're excused using the defense of this. Let me use another term that's very commonly used for 2-615, commercial impracticability. It's commercially impracticable, too bad, send it anyway at a loss. It's commercially impracticable, I'm going to go out of business and I'm going to put 5,000 workers out of business if I have to honor this. And it was not my fault, it's because the mine blew up and now we can't dig out the rare earth or the rare mineral that we need. And not only is it not my fault, and we didn't really foresee it, but it's going to put me and a lot of people out of business. That just goes too far. That might be appropriate defense for the defense of commercial impracticability. Okay? In fact, with regard to difficulty, there's some information on the standards in your 11th edition of the case book at page 323. Take a look at page 322, where are 3 elements to prove commercial impracticability appropriately as a defense, as well as who has the burden of proof. And if you don't realize it's the party claiming the right to defense that has the burden of proof, well, you should have. Okay? The UCC in 2-302 also has a provision on unconscionability. And that's where we look at the time of the making of the contract. Was that contract or was a term in it so unfair by one party with lots of bargaining power imposed on another with very low bargaining power that to enforce the contract or a particular clause in a contract would in fact be unconscionable. And remember, that doesn't rely on facts that happen ex post contracto. That happens the problem has to have existed at the time of the making of the contract. Okay? Another defense could be bad faith. We're working forward, there's a duty to mitigate, you acted in bad faith. Those defenses can come up, sometimes not to remove a duty to pay some damage for breach, but at least to reduce it. Okay? It could do both. Okay, that's enough for class 11, and I'll see you in class.